The barbed wire fence cast long shadows across the frozen ground of Stalag Luft 3 as Technical Sergeant William Bill Henderson pressed his ear against the crude wooden wall of Barracks 14. It was February 23, 1945, and the distant rumble of Soviet artillery had been growing louder for 3 days. The 24-year-old bombardier from Amarillo, Texas, had spent 14 months in this German prisoner of war camp, but today felt different. Today he could hear something in the guards' voices that made his pulse quicken. Fear. The German guards were afraid. Henderson closed his eyes and listened to the muffled conversation beyond the wall, his knowledge of German improving daily out of necessity and survival instinct. What he heard made him freeze. The guards were discussing evacuation orders. They were talking about the end. But there was something else, something about American units approaching from the west, something about Berlin falling, something that couldn't be true. Henderson's breath caught in his throat as he realized what the guards were saying. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. But here, in this frozen hell 60 miles south of Berlin, no one had told the prisoners. No one in Barracks 14 knew that one Texan's desperate act of eavesdropping and translation was about to reveal a truth that would change everything for 371 Allied airmen who still believed they were fighting a war that had already been won. William Henderson had been born in 1921 on a small cotton farm outside Amarillo, where the flat horizons stretched endlessly under the vast Texas sky. His father, Thomas Henderson, had worked the same red dirt that his grandfather had broken with a plow 30 years before, and young Bill grew up understanding that survival meant paying attention to details that others might miss. When the cotton plants showed the first signs of boll weevil damage, when the sky held the particular green tint that meant a tornado was building, when the neighbor's bull had broken through the fence line again, Bill Henderson was usually the first to notice. His mother, Mary Catherine Henderson, had been a school teacher before marriage, and she made sure her son could read and write better than most boys his age. More importantly, she taught him to listen, really listen, to the words people didn't say, to the pauses between sentences, to the way voices changed when people were lying or afraid. These skills, learned in the quiet rhythms of farm life, seemed far removed from military service when Bill enlisted in the Army Air Corps in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. He was 19 years old, tall and lean from farm work, with the steady hands and sharp eyes that made him a natural bombardier. At Midland Army Airfield in Texas, his instructors noted his exceptional ability to calculate drop distances and wind patterns, but they also noticed something else. Henderson had an unusual talent for picking up languages. During training, when the instructors played recordings of German radio transmissions to help bombardiers recognize enemy communications, Henderson began understanding not just individual words, but the rhythm and structure of the language itself. He started staying after training sessions, listening to captured German broadcasts, and asking the intelligence officers for translation help. By the time he shipped out to England in July 1942 as part of the 8th Air Force's 402nd Bomb Group, Technical Sergeant Henderson could understand basic German conversation. He had no idea that this farm boy's curiosity would someday become the key to survival for hundreds of men who had given up hope. Henderson's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, christened Prairie Rose after his mother's favorite flower, flew its first mission over occupied France in September 1942. The crew of 10 men quickly learned to trust their bombardier's steady nerves and precise calculations. Flight Lieutenant James "Mac" McCready, their pilot from Boston, often said that Henderson could drop a bomb into a coffee cup from 25,000 feet if the wind was right. But Henderson's real value became apparent during their 7th mission, when Prairie Rose was hit by German fighters over Hamburg and forced to make an emergency landing in occupied Holland. While the crew hid in a barn, waiting for resistance fighters to help them escape, Henderson's German language skills proved crucial. He could understand the conversations of German patrols searching for them, giving the crew advance warning when soldiers were approaching. For 6 days, Henderson translated overheard communications that kept his crewmates alive until Dutch resistance members could smuggle them back to England. The experience taught Henderson that understanding the enemy's language was more than an academic exercise. It was a weapon. After their return, Henderson volunteered for intelligence training during his off-duty hours, learning to recognize German radio codes, military terminology, and regional dialects. His commanding officer, Colonel Robert Walsh, initially questioned whether a bombardier should spend time on intelligence work, but Henderson's farm boy persistence eventually wore down official resistance. Walsh later wrote in Henderson's service record that the young Texan had an unusual aptitude for gathering information that others miss. That aptitude would be tested beyond anything Henderson could imagine when, on December 15, 1943, Prairie Rose was shot down over Nazi-occupied Poland during a bombing run targeting German aircraft production facilities near Krakow. The strategic bombing campaign of 1943 and 1944 represented the Allies' attempt to cripple German war production through systematic destruction of industrial targets, but the costs were staggering. American bomber crews faced a statistical nightmare. Airmen serving in the 8th Air Force had only a 25% chance of completing their required 25-mission tour of duty. The remainder faced death, injury, or capture at rates that made bomber service one of the war's most dangerous assignments. German fighter pilots flying increasingly sophisticated aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the bomber's vulnerabilities. Anti-aircraft artillery, known as flak, filled the skies over German targets with deadly metal fragments that could shred aircraft and crew with terrifying efficiency. For the men who survived to be captured, the nightmare was just beginning. German prisoner of war camps, officially governed by the Geneva Convention, varied dramatically in their treatment of Allied airmen. Some camps maintained minimal international standards. Others, particularly those run by the SS rather than the regular German military, operated under conditions that bordered on systematic starvation and abuse. Stalag Luft 3, where Henderson found himself after his capture, fell somewhere in the middle. Located near Sagan in occupied Poland, the camp held approximately 10,000 Allied airmen by early 1945, most of them American and British bomber crews shot down over German territory. The camp was administered by the Luftwaffe rather than the SS, which generally meant better treatment than camps run by other German organizations. But conditions remained harsh. Food rations provided barely enough calories for survival. Medical care was minimal. Escape attempts were punished with solitary confinement or worse. By February 1945, however, something fundamental was changing in the war's dynamics, and Henderson's linguistic skills were beginning to reveal cracks in German morale that even the guards couldn't hide. The guards at Stalag Luft 3 had been noticeably different for the past month. Henderson had observed this change with the same attention to detail that his father had taught him to apply to weather patterns and crop conditions. The older guards, men in their 40s and 50s who had been deemed unfit for frontline combat, spoke in hushed tones during their shift changes. Their conversations, which Henderson could now understand with reasonable accuracy, revealed a growing sense of panic about Soviet forces advancing from the east and American units pushing through France and Belgium from the west. More telling were the things they didn't say. Routine announcements about German victories had stopped entirely. Radio news broadcasts in the guard quarters, which Henderson could sometimes overhear from his barracks, focused increasingly on defensive actions rather than offensive operations. Food shipments to the camp had become irregular, suggesting supply line disruptions that indicated serious military problems. Most significantly, Henderson had noticed that several of the camp's administrative staff had begun burning documents in the courtyard behind the main administrative building. This was not the behavior of an army expecting victory. Henderson shared his observations with his barracks mates, particularly Staff Sergeant Robert Tommy Thompson from Oklahoma and Flight Lieutenant Edward Eddie Morrison from Pennsylvania. The three men had formed a tight friendship based on their shared experience surviving the shoot-down of Prairie Rose and their determination to gather intelligence that might help fellow prisoners. Thompson, who had grown up during the Great Depression, possessed an almost supernatural ability to scrounge supplies and information from unlikely sources. Morrison, a former newspaper reporter from Philadelphia, understood how to piece together fragments of information into a coherent picture of larger events. Together, the three men had developed an informal intelligence network within the barracks that tracked German Guard behavior, supply deliveries, and overheard conversations. They had no way of knowing that their careful observations were about to reveal the war's most important secret, and that Henderson's farm boy curiosity would soon uncover a truth that could save lives or get them all killed. The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came on February 20th, 1945, when Henderson overheard two German guards discussing evacuation procedures near the camp's main gate. The conversation, conducted in the rapid, nervous German that Henderson had learned to associate with crisis situations, revealed that Soviet tank units were advancing faster than German command had anticipated. More importantly, one of the guards mentioned that American forces had crossed the Rhine River and were moving toward Berlin from the west. This information contradicted everything the prisoners had been told about German military success and Allied failures. Henderson shared the intelligence with Thompson and Morrison, who agreed that the implications were staggering. If American forces had indeed crossed the Rhine, and if Soviet units were approaching from the east as rapidly as the guards suggested, then German resistance might be collapsing much faster than anyone in the camp realized. The three men decided to increase their surveillance of guard conversations and camp administrative activities. Over the next 3 days, they established a systematic observation schedule that allowed them to monitor guard posts, supply deliveries, and administrative activities without attracting attention from camp security. Thompson used his scavenging skills to position himself near locations where guards gathered during meal breaks. Morrison, whose newspaper experience had taught him to recognize patterns in human behavior, tracked changes in guard routines and administrative procedures. Henderson focused on linguistic intelligence, positioning himself where he could overhear German conversations and translate their contents. What they discovered over the following 72 hours challenged everything they thought they knew about the war's progress. Guards were discussing not just retreat, but complete military collapse. Administrative staff were burning not just routine paperwork, but strategic documents that should have been preserved for future military operations. Most shocking of all, Henderson began overhearing references to unconditional surrender negotiations and the complete occupation of German territory by Allied forces. If these conversations were accurate, then the war was not just turning against Germany, it had already been decided. The prisoners of Stalag Luft III were being held in a camp operated by a government that might no longer exist. The moment of truth arrived at precisely 14:30 hours on February 23, 1945, when Henderson positioned himself against the wall separating Barracks 14 from the camp administrative office. The conversation he overheard between Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the camp's assistant commandant, and Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller, the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for guard operations, revealed information that made Henderson's hands shake with shock and excitement. Speaking in the clipped professional German that military officers used for official communications, Weber was briefing Müller on evacuation orders received from higher command. The Soviet Third Guards Tank Army was less than 40 kilometers away and advancing at a rate that made defense impossible. American tank units of the First Army had crossed the Rhine at Remagen and were moving toward the German heartland faster than Wehrmacht intelligence had believed possible. More shocking still, Weber mentioned that formal surrender negotiations were already underway at the highest levels of German government, and that camp commanders had received preliminary instructions for transferring custody of Allied prisoners to advancing American or Soviet forces. The war, Weber stated matter-of-factly, would be over within days, if not hours. Henderson forced himself to remain motionless against the wall, though his heart was pounding so loudly he was certain the guards could hear it. This information meant that every prisoner in Stalag Luft 3 was still suffering under conditions of captivity, even though their captors had already acknowledged defeat. The implications were staggering and immediate. If German resistance was collapsing as rapidly as Weber suggested, then the guards might abandon the camp entirely, leaving prisoners to face Soviet liberation or potential execution by fleeing SS units. Alternatively, if evacuation orders called for moving prisoners deeper into German territory, the airmen might face a death march that could kill hundreds of men who had already survived months or years of captivity. Most urgently, Henderson realized that his fellow prisoners deserved to know that their suffering had a definite end point, that their families at home probably already knew the war was over, and that liberation was measured in hours rather than months. The question was whether sharing this information would save lives or get everyone killed. Henderson understood that his next decision would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of 371 Allied airmen who still believed they were fighting a war that had already been won. Henderson moved carefully away from the administrative building and made his way back to Barracks 14, where Thompson and Morrison were waiting, with expressions of barely controlled anxiety. The three men had developed a system of subtle hand signals that allowed them to communicate basic information without alerting potential German informants among the prisoners, but the intelligence Henderson had just gathered required more detailed explanation than their signal system could convey. He motioned for his friends to follow him to the southeastern corner of the barracks, where a damaged ventilation grate provided cover for whispered conversations. In careful, measured words, Henderson reported what he had overheard, translating the German military terminology into plain English that conveyed both the tactical situation and its broader implications. Thompson's face went pale as he absorbed the information. Morrison's newspaper training kicked in, and he immediately began asking detailed questions about Henderson's translation accuracy and the reliability of the sources. Both men understood that if Henderson's intelligence was correct, they faced a decision that would affect every prisoner in their barracks and potentially the entire camp. Sharing the information could provide hope and allow prisoners to prepare for liberation or evacuation, but it could also trigger panic that might provoke German guards into violent retaliation. Worse, if the information was somehow inaccurate, or if Henderson had misunderstood critical details, raising false hopes could be as devastating as the continued uncertainty. Morrison, drawing on his journalism experience, suggested that they needed additional confirmation before taking any action. Thompson, whose Depression-era pragmatism had kept him alive through months of captivity, argued that they needed to prepare their barracks mates for rapid changes, regardless of the specific details. Henderson found himself caught between hope and caution, understanding that his farm boy instincts for reading people and situations had never been tested under circumstances this critical. The decision they reached would later be cited in military intelligence reports as an example of how individual initiative and language skills could provide tactical advantages that saved lives and improved military effectiveness under extraordinary circumstances. The three men agreed on a carefully structured approach that balanced information sharing with security precautions. Henderson would continue monitoring German communications to gather additional confirmation of the intelligence he had obtained. Thompson would begin discreet preparations for possible rapid evacuation or liberation, including stockpiling medical supplies and food reserves that might be needed during a transition period. Morrison would carefully share selected information with trusted prisoners in their barracks, focusing on the need to prepare for change without revealing the specific details that might cause panic or attract German attention. Over the next 18 hours, this strategy evolved into an informal intelligence operation that demonstrated remarkable sophistication given the limited resources and extreme security constraints. Henderson discovered that his position in the camp's work detail assignments gave him access to locations near German administrative and communication facilities during regular duty hours. By volunteering for additional work shifts and positioning himself strategically during routine activities, he could monitor German radio communications, telephone conversations, and face-to-face briefings between camp officers. Thompson's reputation as someone who could obtain necessary supplies made him a natural coordinator for emergency preparations that appeared routine to German observers. Morrison's ability to gauge human reactions and manage information flow proved crucial for maintaining security while keeping fellow prisoners informed enough to make intelligent decisions about their own safety. The network they established during those critical hours became a model for prisoner intelligence operations that military analysts later studied and incorporated into training programs for personnel facing capture situations. More immediately, their work revealed that Henderson's initial intelligence had been completely accurate, and that the war situation was changing even faster than German officers had anticipated. By the evening of February 24, 1945, Henderson had overheard three separate conversations confirming that German High Command had initiated unconditional surrender negotiations with Allied representatives, and that combat operations were expected to cease within 48 to 72 hours. The war was over. Victory was complete. And somehow the prisoners of Stalag Luft 3 were among the last people to know. The breakthrough came at 06:15 hours on February 25, 1945, when Henderson overheard a telephone conversation between Camp Commandant Oberst Friedrich Brenner and an unidentified officer at German Army Group Center headquarters. The conversation, conducted in urgent whispered German that Henderson had to strain to understand, revealed that Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, that German military resistance had collapsed entirely, and that Soviet forces were less than 10 kilometers from Stalag Luft 3. Most significantly, Brenner was receiving orders to abandon the camp immediately and allow Allied prisoners to await liberation by advancing American or Soviet units. The conversation ended with Brenner acknowledging that Guard personnel would withdraw during the night of February 25th to 26th, leaving the camp effectively under prisoner control until Allied forces arrived. Henderson felt his knees go weak as he absorbed the full implications of what he had just heard. The war was not just ending, it had ended. Hitler was dead. German resistance had collapsed. Liberation was not a matter of days or hours, but minutes. Most importantly, the information he had gathered through careful observation and translation had provided his fellow prisoners with advance warning that could prevent chaos, injury, or death during the transition from German to Allied control. Henderson realized that his farm boy instincts for paying attention to details that others missed had evolved into genuine intelligence skills that had provided tactical advantages under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The Texan, who had learned to read weather patterns and animal behavior on his father's cotton farm, had learned to read human behavior and military situations in ways that could save lives and preserve hope when everything seemed hopeless. As he made his way back to Barracks 14 to share this final decisive intelligence with Thompson and Morrison, Henderson understood that he was carrying information that would transform the lives of 371 Allied airmen who had endured months or years of captivity, believing they were still fighting a war that had already been won. What they did with this information during the next 24 hours would determine whether liberation became a celebration or a tragedy, whether survival became victory or meaningless waste. Henderson had learned that Germany had lost the war, but he had also learned that knowing the truth was only the beginning of the responsibility that came with such knowledge. The news spread through Barracks 14 with the controlled precision that Morrison's newspaper background had taught him was essential for managing information that could trigger panic or celebration in equal measure. Henderson, Thompson, and Morrison had agreed that revealing Hitler's death immediately might cause an emotional reaction that could alert German guards to their intelligence network. So Morrison shared the information in carefully measured stages that allowed their barracks mates to absorb the implications gradually. First, he reported that German guard behavior indicated major military developments that suggested Allied victory was imminent. Second, he shared Henderson's assessment that German communications revealed significant supply and command problems consistent with military collapse. Finally, he explained that multiple intelligence indicators suggested that liberation was a matter of hours rather than weeks or months, and that prisoners should prepare for rapid changes in camp administration and control. The response from their fellow airmen revealed the full emotional range of men who had survived months or years of captivity while maintaining hope that seemed increasingly fragile with each passing day. Staff Sergeant Michael Mick O'Connor from Chicago, who had been shot down 13 months earlier, sat in stunned silence for several minutes before asking quietly whether Henderson was certain about his translations. Flight Lieutenant Dave Richardson from California, whose B-24 Liberator had been shot down over Romania, began crying with relief he couldn't control or explain. Technical Sergeant Tony Marchetti from New York, who had maintained detailed records of his captivity in hopes of providing military intelligence after liberation, immediately began organizing his documentation for transfer to American authorities. Most significantly, the men began demonstrating the quiet professionalism that had made them effective aircrew members before their capture. Instead of celebration or chaos, they began systematic preparation for liberation that included securing medical supplies, organizing personnel records, and identifying prisoners who might need special assistance during the transition period. Henderson watched his barracks mates transform from prisoners surviving day to day into soldiers preparing for return to duty, and he understood that the intelligence he had provided had given them something more valuable than hope. It had given them purpose and control over their own fate during circumstances that had previously left them powerless to influence their own survival. The German guards began withdrawing from Stalag Luft III at approximately 2200 hours on February 25, 1945, exactly as Henderson's intelligence had predicted. The withdrawal was conducted with military precision that demonstrated German organizational efficiency even under circumstances of complete defeat, but Henderson and his network were able to monitor the process because they understood what to look for and when to expect it. From their observation posts around the barracks, the three men watched German personnel load essential equipment and documentation into trucks, while leaving behind supplies and facilities that would be needed by Allied prisoners until liberation forces arrived. Oberst Brenner posted notices in German and English explaining that camp administration was being transferred to senior Allied prisoners pending arrival of American or Soviet forces, and that prisoners should maintain camp organization and discipline during the transition period. The notices did not mention that the war was over. that Hitler was dead or that German military resistance had collapsed entirely. But Henderson's translation of overheard conversations revealed that camp personnel had been explicitly ordered to avoid sharing information that might trigger prisoner celebrations that could attract unwanted attention from retreating SS units in the area. By 0300 hours on February 26th, the last German guards had departed, leaving Stalag Luft III under the informal control of Colonel James "Jim" Stewart, the senior American officer among the prisoners, and Group Captain Sir Reginald "Reggie" Thompson, the senior British officer. Henderson, Morrison, and Thompson reported their intelligence to both men, who agreed that the information should be shared carefully with prisoners throughout the camp to prevent panic while allowing everyone to prepare for liberation. Over the next 6 hours, word spread through all camp barracks that German resistance had collapsed, that Allied forces were approaching rapidly, and that liberation was imminent. The response was extraordinary. Rather than chaos or uncontrolled celebration, the prisoners demonstrated the discipline and professionalism that had made them effective military personnel before their capture. They organized security patrols to maintain order within the camp. They prepared medical facilities for potential casualties during the liberation process. They organized their personnel records and intelligence information for transfer to Allied authorities. Most importantly, they maintained the hope and mutual support that had sustained them through months or years of captivity while preparing for return to freedom and active duty. When American armored units of the Third Army arrived at Stalag Luft III at 14:20 hours on February 26, 1945, they found not chaos or confusion, but organized military personnel ready for immediate evacuation and repatriation. The liberation of Stalag Luft III proceeded with remarkable efficiency because Henderson's intelligence network had provided advance warning that allowed prisoners to prepare systematically for the transition from captivity to freedom. Captain Robert "Bob" Mitchell, commanding officer of the American armored unit that reached the camp first, later reported that the prisoners' organization and preparation had significantly simplified the liberation process and probably prevented casualties that might have resulted from chaos or confusion during the transition. More importantly, the intelligence that Henderson had gathered through his linguistic skills and careful observation provided American forces with valuable information about German military capabilities, supply situations, and troop movements in the area. Henderson's translations of German communications revealed that Wehrmacht units were retreating in disarray, that supply lines had collapsed entirely, and that civilian populations were fleeing westward to avoid Soviet occupation. This information helped American commanders plan their advance through the region and allocate resources for managing displaced populations and captured enemy personnel. Henderson himself was evacuated to a field hospital in France, where medical examination revealed that his physical condition was remarkably good considering the length and conditions of his captivity. Military intelligence officers interviewed him extensively about his observations of German military organization, prisoner treatment policies, and communication procedures, but Henderson's most valuable contribution remained his demonstration that individual initiative and specialized skills could provide tactical advantages under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. After 3 weeks of medical evaluation and intelligence debriefing, Henderson was flown to New York and then to San Antonio, Texas, where he arrived on March 22, 1945, exactly 3 months after his capture and 2 weeks after Germany's formal surrender had ended the war in Europe. He had learned that Germany had lost the war while imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp, but he had also learned that information was only as valuable as the courage required to gather it and the wisdom required to use it responsibly. Most importantly, he had learned that individual actions could influence outcomes even under circumstances that seemed completely beyond individual control. These lessons would shape the rest of his life in ways that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted during those crucial days in February 1945. Henderson returned to his family's cotton farm outside Amarillo, Texas, in April 1945, where his parents and younger sister welcomed him with quiet celebration that reflected their family's reserved approach to emotional expression. His father, Thomas Henderson, had continued working the farm throughout the war while dealing with labor shortages and equipment rationing that made agricultural production more challenging than anyone outside farming communities understood. His mother, Mary Catherine Henderson, had spent the months of his captivity writing letters to military authorities, Red Cross officials, and congressional representatives seeking information about her son's condition and location. His sister, Margaret Henderson, had graduated from high school the previous year and was working as a telephone operator in Amarillo while saving money for teacher training college. The family's reunion was complicated by the fact that Henderson's military experiences had changed him in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had not shared similar experiences. But his parents' practical wisdom and emotional stability provided the foundation he needed for readjustment to civilian life. Henderson enrolled at Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College in September 1945, using educational benefits provided by the GI Bill to study agricultural engineering with a secondary focus on communications technology. His military experience had taught him that understanding different languages and communication systems could provide advantages in situations far beyond military service, and he was determined to develop these skills in ways that might prove useful in civilian careers. More immediately, he began writing detailed accounts of his prisoner of war experiences for military historical records, focusing particularly on the intelligence-gathering techniques that had provided advance warning of liberation. Military analysts who reviewed his accounts noted that Henderson's systematic approach to observation and translation demonstrated principles that could be applied to intelligence training for personnel facing capture situations. They also noted that his emphasis on teamwork and careful information management had probably prevented casualties and contributed to the successful liberation of Stalag Luft 3. Henderson's accounts became part of standard training materials used by military intelligence services for the next 2 decades, ensuring that his farm boy instincts for paying attention to details that others missed would continue influencing military effectiveness long after his own service had ended. Henderson graduated from Texas A&M in 1949 with degrees in agricultural engineering and communications, married his longtime girlfriend, Sarah Elizabeth Cowan from Lubbock, and established a farm equipment business that specialized in radio communication systems for agricultural operations. His business, Henderson Communications, grew steadily throughout the 1950s and 60s by providing farmers with radio systems that allowed them to coordinate planting, harvesting, and livestock management activities across large properties. Henderson's understanding of how communication systems could provide tactical advantages proved as valuable in agricultural applications as it had in military service, and his business became one of the first to recognize that farming communities needed sophisticated communication capabilities that matched their increasingly complex operational requirements. More significantly, Henderson maintained contact with many of his fellow prisoners from Stalag Luft 3, organizing annual reunions that allowed the men to maintain friendships forged under extraordinary circumstances, while supporting each other through the long-term adjustments required by their wartime experiences. These reunions, held each February 26th to commemorate their liberation, became opportunities for the men to share their stories with family members who had not previously understood the full details of their captivity and liberation. Henderson's role as the man who had learned that Germany had lost the war before any other prisoner knew became a central element of these stories. But the men who shared those experiences understood that his linguistic skills and intelligence gathering had been important primarily because of his courage in using them responsibly under circumstances that could have resulted in severe punishment or death. Flight Lieutenant Edward Morrison, Henderson's friend who had helped manage information flow within the camp, wrote in a letter years later that Henderson had demonstrated that individual skills and initiative could influence outcomes even under seemingly hopeless circumstances, and that this lesson had continued influencing his approach to challenges throughout his civilian career. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, Henderson's friend who had organized practical preparations for liberation, noted that Henderson's farm boy instincts for reading people and situations had proved as valuable in prisoner of war camp as they had been on his father's cotton farm, and that this demonstrated the universal applicability of basic human skills like observation, patience, and sound judgment. These testimonies from men who had shared Henderson's experiences provided authoritative confirmation that his actions had influenced outcomes in ways that saved lives and preserved hope during circumstances that had tested human endurance and resilience to their limits. Henderson lived and worked in the Texas Panhandle for the rest of his life, raising 4 children with Sarah and building a business that provided communications services to farming communities throughout the region while maintaining the quiet modesty that had characterized his personality since childhood. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences except during the annual reunions with his fellow prisoners, and he never described himself as a hero, despite letters from grateful families whose sons and husbands had survived captivity, partly because of intelligence he had provided. Henderson understood that his contributions had been important primarily because he had been in the right place with the right skills at the right time, and that hundreds of other Allied prisoners had demonstrated similar courage and initiative under equally challenging circumstances. His business success reflected the same attention to detail and systematic observation that had served him during his military service, but Henderson always insisted that his most important accomplishment had been learning to work effectively with other people under circumstances that tested everyone's capacity for cooperation and mutual support. When Henderson died in 1998 at the age of 76, his funeral was attended by dozens of fellow veterans, business associates, and family friends. But the most moving tribute came from Tommy Thompson's son, who had grown up hearing stories about the Texan who had learned that Germany had lost the war while still imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp. Thompson's son noted that Henderson had never claimed credit for heroic actions, but had always emphasized the importance of teamwork, careful observation, and responsible decision-making under pressure, and that these lessons had influenced not just military effectiveness, but approaches to family life, business operations, and community service throughout his post-war career. Henderson's life demonstrated that heroism often consisted not of dramatic individual actions, but of persistent attention to details that others missed, combined with the courage to act on that information in ways that served purposes larger than personal survival or advancement. His story proved that farm boy instincts for reading weather patterns and animal behavior could translate into intelligence skills that saved lives under the most challenging circumstances, and that individual actions could influence outcomes even when those outcomes seemed completely beyond individual control. Most importantly, Henderson's story illustrated that learning difficult truths was only the beginning of the responsibility that came with such knowledge, and that using information wisely and courageously was often more important than the dramatic circumstances under which that information was obtained. The liberation of Stalag Luft III on February 26, 1945, became a case study used by military intelligence training programs because Henderson's intelligence gathering had demonstrated how individual language skills and systematic observation could provide tactical advantages that influenced outcomes far beyond what anyone involved had expected at the time. Military analysts noted that Henderson's approach to gathering and sharing information had balanced security requirements with the need to prepare fellow prisoners for rapidly changing circumstances, and that this balance had probably prevented casualties while maintaining morale and discipline during a critical transition period. More broadly, Henderson's story became part of a larger historical narrative about how individual Americans had responded to extraordinary challenges during World War II by using whatever skills and resources they possessed to serve purposes larger than their own survival or advancement. His farm boy background, his linguistic curiosity, his systematic approach to observation, and his sense of responsibility to fellow prisoners had combined to create a form of heroism that was both uniquely individual and representative of broader American values during wartime. The fact that Henderson had learned Germany had lost the war while still imprisoned in a German prisoner of war camp highlighted the strange ironies and unexpected circumstances that characterized military service during global conflict. But it also demonstrated that individual actions could influence outcomes even under circumstances that seemed completely beyond individual control. Henderson's story proved that heroism often consisted of paying attention to details that others missed, having the courage to act on information that others might ignore, and accepting responsibility for fellow human beings even when that responsibility carried significant personal risks. These lessons remained relevant for military personnel, intelligence operatives, and civilian leaders long after World War II ended because they illustrated principles of observation, decision-making, and leadership that applied to challenging circumstances regardless of their specific historical context. Henderson never claimed that his actions had been more important than those of thousands of other Allied prisoners who had demonstrated similar courage and initiative under equally difficult circumstances, but his story provided a specific example of how individual skills and character could influence outcomes in ways that served larger purposes than personal survival or advancement. The POW who learned Germany had lost the war from a Texas farm had really learned something more important, that individual actions matter even under seemingly hopeless circumstances, and that heroism often consists of doing the right thing with whatever skills and resources are available, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes the importance of those actions at the time. Henderson's legacy raises questions that remain relevant decades after his death. Would you have had the courage to gather information that could save lives, even when discovery might result in severe punishment or death? Would you have shared intelligence that could provide hope to fellow prisoners, even when accuracy could not be guaranteed and false hope might prove as devastating as continued uncertainty? Would you have accepted responsibility for fellow human beings, even when that responsibility required using skills and taking risks that went far beyond normal military duties? Henderson answered these questions through actions rather than words, demonstrating that heroism often consists not of dramatic gestures, but of persistent attention to details that others miss, combined with the courage to act on that information in ways that serve purposes larger than personal survival. His story illustrates that individual Americans responding to extraordinary circumstances during World War II often found strength and capability they didn't know they possessed, and that farm boy instincts for reading weather patterns and animal behavior could translate into intelligence skills that influenced outcomes under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Most importantly, Henderson's story proves that learning difficult truths is only the beginning of the responsibility that comes with knowledge, and that using information wisely and courageously is often more important than the dramatic circumstances under which that information was obtained. The Texas cotton farmer who became a bombardier, who became a prisoner of war, who became an intelligence gatherer, who became a liberator of his fellow prisoners, demonstrated that American values, like individual initiative, personal responsibility, and mutual support could survive and even flourish under circumstances designed to destroy hope and human dignity. Share this story with others who understand that heroism comes in many forms, and comment below to let us know. Would you have broken military protocol and risked severe punishment to provide fellow prisoners with information that could save lives, preserve hope, and prepare them for liberation? Henderson's farm boy wisdom, linguistic skills, and quiet courage changed the fate of 371 Allied airmen who learned that their suffering had meaning and that their liberation was certain rather than merely hoped for, proving that individual actions can influence outcomes even under circumstances that seem completely beyond individual control.